So I will get started by saying this about this presentation. It's a little bit of a caveat, okay? So when we did the poll this past, it was a couple months ago, when we asked, do you even still want to have a summer cola? And if you do, what do you want us to talk about? And the number one topic was trauma. So that's why that's the first topic we addressed, because that was heavy on your minds at the time. And of course, at the time in the spring, you were all struggling to figure out how to connect with families virtually and how to do Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all of these other things, or try to piece together some sort of patchwork of um, activities through a virtual medium, right? And so the second thing that was on there was, how do I connect with families virtually? And how do I connect with children virtually? And I do want to say, this little caveat here is that, the Autism Center for Excellence is a research-based facility, right? Everything we do is rooted in research. We're not going to have you waste your time trying 20 different things when the really good stuff, the research tells you these 5 over here are really going to be powerful. The same thing applies to connecting with children virtually, especially young children with ASD who struggle with joint attention, with communication, with just being able to sit in one spot and not have the camera follow you throughout the entire house, right? So there's just not a lot of research out there. And I think we all know why, right? In-person instruction is where it's at. Dawn even mentioned this morning that it's not ideal. But we also know that these are strange times that we live in. And while that the fall, everyone's goal is to be in the classroom and to be engaging children's in person, right? We don't know what's going to happen. And so what we decided to do with this presentation was to basically prepare you in some weird eventuality. It is 2020. So, what if, we do have to try to engage families virtually again for a short period of time? What is the evidence base for this? What does the research tell us? How can we do this in a systematic manner that's meaningful for families? Okay, so that's where this presentation is coming from. That is the perspective that we are taking throughout this, and we're going to walk you through this step by step. Just remember, there's a couple of caveats we'll have in here, like warnings, like your division may not let you do this, right? So, this is just telling you what the research says and, what has been done already in this field. Okay. So Stefanie, I'm going to let you take over for this slide.
Thank you. Hopefully I'm off mute now. Hopefully everyone had a wonderful little break there and took care of your social, emotional, and physiological needs. I appreciate you coming back after lunch and being with us again. So as educators, you all are focused on designing classrooms, incorporating aspects of the curriculum throughout the day, differentiating instruction, and providing that welcome and inclusive environment for all types of learners, right? While families have played a role in education, early education, COVID kind of forced us to switch gears, if you will, in a dramatic and sometimes completely foreign ways, right? We, again, let's just say, we don't have that much research in doing this, and we'll talk about how early intervention does and what they do and kind of taking or trying to learn from that model. But we've never done this. And in some instances, whether it was a Zoom platform or GoToMeetings or however, whatever type of platform that you may have experienced in these last, 12 weeks, or most of you are out of school, but around 12 weeks, it's very different, right? It's completely different how to connect. And it's a lot different than being there live and in person, and what you can do and what you can't do and so forth. So in some sense, no one could have ever imagined like that we'd be in this position where we'd have to figure it out. And so really thinking about that sometimes we're figuring out right as we go along. There was not much time when schools stopped. And you didn't really have time to go get things and pack up and do all the things, since it was such an abrupt situation and scenario. And so we no one really imagined that we'd be this way, and it's really felt like sort of our world has been turned upside down. And I can't imagine if I were back in the classroom how, I'm looking at it from this perspective, and I always remember that. But truly, as we've talked about, that you all are in the trenches, right? You all are the ones that are doing this, and you all have felt that impact, and that um, that your worlds have been turned upside down of how you typically connect with children and their families. So we really, what we've learned from this is that COVID has really um, forced us to shift our focus, and shifting it from the classroom to home, right? So those last, whether it was 12 weeks or however long that you finished up school from the beginning of COVID and the shutdown in March, really it made us to have to focus on that family, right? And how do we provide, whether it's supports and coaching and whatever we're doing, and use them as that medium, as what we know about the first teachers, and how do we do that? So what we don't know, we really don't have a lot of research in this, right? Before now, we haven't had to recreate a whole preschool day with a virtual medium. As far as I know, there's not a whole lot of research on this is how a day should run in a virtual format and look like a typical preschool day, right? And we talk about that. What we have learned is that young children, they don't yet read, they don't have the technology and so forth. And so again, how do you do that, and keep a child's attention, and interacting with whatever platform or whatever type of model that you use in this digital world? So what we know that coaching is an adult learning strategy, right? You all participated in some form or are going to participate in some form of coaching as a part of Project Pass. So again, we're all of the participants today are either in Project Pass or will be starting Project Pass in the fall. So that may have looked differently as far as what you kind of received digitally, right? What you received live and in person, or what you did online, or how you were coached. But we know that it's an adult learning strategy that helps to build that capacity, whether it's a parent, a colleague, and it's a supportive relationship, again, to help with the understanding of not only that knowledge, but increasing that implementation. So that knowledge to practice, right? And sort of that gap. And we know that typically when we look at early intervention models, and Alicia's going to speak to this a lot more, that looks differently than probably what you all have experienced with coaching. But we know that coaching is effective in really helping to build those skills and build that implementation.
So Stephanie's right. In terms of early intervention, a lot of my experience before I came to ACE was in early intervention, and I worked with early intervention groups at the state level or through other agencies, and kind of, was assisted with different services and whatnot. So I can tell you that coaching families has a long, rich history in early intervention. And I know that this is early childhood and that things are different. And that if you are a parent who has experienced early intervention and you have transitioned to early childhood, there's a little bit of a whiplash, right? Like things are very different from one to the other. And you have to get used to a whole new series of services and expectations and how things unfold. But in early intervention, coaching is a way of life, right? Because my sister, I was lucky enough to be blessed with a sister who is an occupational therapist, who is very well versed in autism spectrum disorder and interventions. And one of the things that she said to me when my son was in early intervention was, Alicia, Ewan's not going to make the progress when it's just the focus is on that hour that that therapist is there. Ewan is going to make the most progress when you do the carryover work and you really take what it is that therapist is trying to teach you and show you how to do and use it the rest of the day. Because it's not the 1 hour that makes a difference. It's the other 23 that will change his life. And I took that to heart. And so I am an all in, let's do it. Coaching families is the way to go, right? And so we do know that this works. We do. but we know that from an early intervention standpoint. It's not as something that we know as easily in terms of the preschool environment and how this plays out, right? But now we're having to learn to think about things a little bit differently because of COVID-19. So one of the things that we do know about research, what we do know about research and what we know about children and what we know about children with ASD and families is that parent-mediated interventions, where the parents are the primary person using an intervention practice with their own child, works. We know this, right? The evidence is there. In this situation, practitioners would teach parents in individual or in group formats in the home or community settings. And they might use a variety of different methods, whether that's didactic instruction, discussions, modeling, coaching, performance feedback, whatever it is. But the parent's role in this intervention is to practice teaching their child new skills, right? And to maybe in some situations is to decrease challenging behavior. And once the parents are trained in all of that, they then implement all or part of that intervention with the child on their own. They've been coached through it, and now they're going to implement it. It seems very similar to what we're doing with Project Pass, right? We're coaching you to use these interventions, and then you're on your own, right? So there's not this huge gap, right? You have some sort of knowledge base that kind of gives you this perspective like, aha, this is what we're talking about here. The thing about there we go. The thing about parent-mediated interventions, it's very specific, and it's a little different from, say, just early intervention and coaching, right? Early intervention is I love early intervention. I love everything about it. But one of the things that can be frustrating is that it's a little bit, all over the place, right? In some situations, it's what's the family focused on this week? Or maybe what are some of the challenges that we're facing? Or what is the big goal that we have? And so sometimes it's a little bit like chasing a rabbit. You're all over the place, right? In a parent-mediated intervention, we have really systematic, specific training components of this, right? It's not just parent caregiver awareness or, there's just some, conversations about different topics. This is a training, right? It's very similar in the way that you guys have been through a Project Pass training. It's not just what do you guys want to talk about? We have a very specific plan, right? And then the other aspect to it is, implementing this coaching part and this, implementing practices at home. So now in a normal situation, a trained provider is able to be there in the home, they're there in person, very much like early intervention, and they're able to give that feedback in the moment as it is happening, okay? There's plenty of information about parent-mediated interventions, and you'll have to excuse me, I use the old term parent-mediated intervention, and I cannot stop. But the new term that the research is using is parent-implemented intervention, and that's because we have peer-mediated, and they don't want to get the two PMIs confused. So if you hear me say parent-mediated and then you see parent-implemented, just know that they're the same thing. But if you really want to know some of the step-by-step individual components that go into this, I really highly recommend the Affirm modules. This is an excellent, excellent resource. And so this brief packet is just one thing. You can actually go through that whole online module. And that is free of charge. It's not something that it's going to cost you to use. It's a great resource. Okay. So what else do we know, though? So let's switch gears from parent-mediated interventions. What else do we know? Well, we know that telehealth is an actual telecommunications technology, boy, say that 3 times, to provide therapeutic services at a distance. Now, if any of you have had to use the doctor when things were really, those shelter at home and stay at home places were really kind of strict, you had to use telehealth. I was one of them. I had to telehealth my doctor, right? And this is an accepted practice that we use with physicians, but we also use it with interventions, right? You will notice that there were a lot of states that moved their early intervention to virtual, right? We're going to continue giving services. We're going to do this virtually. Some states had already actually been doing that to some degree because we have families who are in really remote locations. Military families are ones that have used telehealth before. So this is not completely foreign to us, right? And there are actually some parent-mediated interventions that had been using tele-interventions up until this point. So what do we mean by tele-intervention or telehealth? What are some of the terms that you need to be aware of, right? This gets a little technical, but honestly, it's probably simpler than what you think because we're doing some of it right now. So when we talk about tele-intervention delivery, we're either talking about synchronous, asynchronous, or a hybrid model, okay? Synchronous, real time, it's what we're doing right this moment. We are live. We are trying to interact. Well, I'm talking and you're listening, but at times we're interacting, right? This is a way for us to do this in real time. There's no lag. Hopefully there's no lag. And you're able to really just keep up in this real time fashion, right? What's the benefit of a real time synchronous delivery? Well, you get the interaction. You get to ask questions, right? You get immediate feedback. So if you say, wait, whoa, 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 what do you mean by synchronous delivery? I am totally confused. Can we step back a second? We can take a break. We can be like, okay, let's go over this one more time. That is the absolute number one benefit to synchronous delivery. What we need to think about if we're going to be using any of these deliveries with families raising children with ASD is that our families, and I can say this because I'm one of them, okay? Our families are also struggling with some of the same characteristics that our children with ASD are struggling with. They may not have a diagnosis, it may not be formal, but I can tell you that we struggle in some way with some of the same characteristics that our children do. Sometimes it's attention. Sometimes it's some of those executive functioning frontal lobe skills that we're talking about. Sometimes it's sensory issues. Sometimes it's communication and processing information, right? So what happens if we're in this live synchronous session? Well, what was it like when we did the Jamboard just a little while ago? There's a lot of pressure on you, right? And you've got to come up with something. What if it's just one-on-one and it's not this whole group and say someone else can maybe, interact this time. I don't need to say anything. What if it's one-on-one? There's a lot of pressure on that other person to do something, right? To answer a question, to learn something, right? It's really, it's a high stakes environment in some ways. And it may also be difficult for a family to engage in this synchronous live learning when they've got a child with ASD running around the house. Sometimes they're screaming, sometimes there's sensory issues, sometimes they're, wanting to hang from their shoulders, right? And they're trying to learn. So we can encourage interactions and really facilitate discussion, but it may not be ideal. And something else to think about is our children with ASD often take time to process information, right? We often use concrete written supports just for this and visual supports so that it can kind of support their auditory processing challenges. Our families may have the same issues. So if we're asking them to think and do, and we have all this pressure, are they really processing what you're saying? So one of the things I would say is don't put too much emphasis on a synchronous live learning. Don't put all your eggs in one basket here. So it's a good component to have, but it may not be the only one that you need. Another one is asynchronous. This occurs at a learner's pace, right? So this is not live. There's no pressure. You can do it in your pajamas. You can do it super late at night if you're a night owl, and you can do it super early in the morning if you like to get up with the sun. These are things like a self-paced course, right? So what's the benefits of asynchronous learning? Well, it's very convenient, right? There's a very flexible pace. You don't have to worry about some of the sessions going over. You get to do it as you want to, right? And you can review it again and again and again. You don't need to be concerned with saying, gosh, I'd love to ask this question again, but I don't want everyone to stop and just go over it just for me, right? But if you have asynchronous self-paced learning, if you need to read something 12 times, you can. If you need to watch a video 12 times, you can. That's the benefit. So what is the consideration for families raising children with ASD? Well, it does the same thing. It allows them to learn at their own pace. And when it's convenient, maybe when their child is sleeping, hopefully they're sleeping at some point during the day or night. It's a concrete way, right? Just like we use visual supports for our young children with ASD, think of this asynchronous situation as a visual support for our families who are raising children with ASD. They can review it again and again and again. And it allows them to process that information over time and probably to generate more meaningful comments and questions rather than in that live synchronous session where I'm putting all this pressure on them. Can you actually really come up with a meaningful question or comment when you're under that much pressure? It's hard. And we don't want to think of any intervention as a quiz for families, right? Or a test. So what's the answer? Most likely it's a hybrid situation, which includes a self-paced component that you get to do at your own pace. It's flexible, it's convenient, and it has those real-time learning opportunities. Does this sound familiar to anybody? It should. This is Project Pass. Now, I will say that some of you that were in previous iterations of Project Pass, you were in the version where we were doing live in-person trainings or coaching sessions, observations. And something that we want to share with you is that we have changed gears a little bit. And we actually now include more virtual options in Project Pass. And Stephanie's actually going to go over these a little bit more where we talk about virtual coaching and things like that. But I want you to know, we practice what we preach now. Okay, so we're going to tell you, you can do these things, and we are also doing them ourselves in Project Pass right now. So the benefits of a hybrid delivery is that you have more time to digest information, more time to develop meaningful questions, and you get those real-time interactions when you do the live sessions. So those hybrid situations are just better for families that are learning new information at that individual pace, convenience, gives them actually an opportunity to record some things rather than having to observe live through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever it is. One of the things I watched not too long ago about teleinterventions with early childhood was kind of talking about, well, you can always use your cell phone and you can put it in your pocket here to where that your camera is sticking out, so that if you have to chase your child around the room so that the teacher can observe them, then you've got it covered. Your camera's right here and you've got hands free. And one of the things I thought was, oh my gosh, as a video and training person, so all the trainings that you do come through my computer at some point, right? All the videos that you watch come through my computer. And I am a stickler about the video that you guys watch. If I can't hear it, I'm worried. If I can't see what I want to see, I'm worried, right? I'm going to tell you right now, that's not a good video to get to try and observe and use and give feedback on, right? You want good video, you want good audio, and doing that live may not be the answer. So all of this hybrid stuff allows you to get the video that you want. It allows you to have the discussions that you want. But how does this apply to parent-mediated interventions, right? Because we've been talking about coaching families and all this other good stuff from early intervention. Well, how does it apply to this? There's actually a project called Project Impact that has been going for several years now. And one of the things that they do, and they include regularly as part of this package, is teleintervention. And so they actually have a manualized EVP curriculum. They focus on several evidence-based practices, but they have a focus specifically on social communication skills. And that's one thing you'll find in any parent-mediated interventions. They're not throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this family. They're doing really specific targeted skills that they know are going to be the biggest bang for the buck for that family, right? That we know we're really going to push things forward. And in Project Impact, they also have individual and group sessions, right? Okay. So how are we going to make this work? How do we actually apply all of this and bring it together and put it into something that's usable? Stefanie, I'm going to let you take over here for a few slides and give my voice a break.
So as you see on our lovely slide, we provide this warning, right? We are not here to tell you, to pick a platform or to go about doing this. We are simply providing this information in the event that this is something that would be useful in the whole grand scheme of what may come up in the fall, right? There may be where you have sort of you go back to school, but then there's a pause. There may be where they're not there as many days of the week and you need to have more of that ongoing kind of coaching and follow up for what's going to take place in the home, right? But we want to say we're not providing the guidance or telling you exactly how to do this. We're simply giving you the information as something to think about what we've experienced. So you're going to rely on what your school division does, right? Always think about that. But we want to think about how can we maybe help to coach in whatever event or scenario. How could we possibly think about this hybrid model to coach on evidence-based practices? So if you look at this little list of 4, these are basically the elements of Project Pass, right? That you all went through, that you experienced in some form. And again, that may look different depending on what cohort or what year. If this year we've definitely beefed up as far as what we're doing virtually. But you had some sort of live training, right? We did that online component where you would take a module in the ACE dashboard if you were doing the dashboard at the time, and then we'd come back together and we'd have a live professional development center session where we could sit for a couple hours and we could talk about what you learned. We could have some interactive activities. We could problem solve, and you got to be with your colleagues or your cohort in many cases, and you were relieved from classroom duties in many cases where we weren't doing this during obviously student time, or you didn't have to be in the classroom doing this. There's the observation piece, right? So we came in and observed with the APERS at times. That might have been the pre-observation, right? The big classroom observation. Sometimes there were student assessments, but we also did also came in, if I was your coach, to do ongoing observations. Whatever practice that was we were kind of working on based on professional development goals that we had set down and determined, that those were the practices that I would come in and help to observe and provide. Then afterwards I would provide feedback on how's it going. So watching those in practice and then providing that feedback. So these are all things that you all have been familiar as far as those elements.
And we want you to think about this as a guide, right? You have this experience, let's use it in some way. If for some reason we have to go back and where we have to try these virtual explorations with children and their families, let's use that experience as a guide to move forward, right? We can use that in some way. Now think about the online training that you had for Project Pass. It wasn't just a willy-nilly, let's kind of talk about what you want to do, think about something new you want to learn. We had a plan. We had a very specific plan going into it, and it was very systematic. We had you go in a specific order because we knew that this would help you kind of implement these things and continue to use them long after we had left. So this is a really good thing that we want you to think about as we talk about any sort of implementing any kind of virtual parent-mediated intervention.
So this just looks at kind of that coaching cycle, if you will, that larger cycle of what goes on in coaching. And that may look differently depending on if you look at the National Professional Development Center and their coaching model or practice-based coaching, right? And so looking at kind of that overall what takes place in those iteration of the cycle and using that as your guide as well. So whatever training that you have had, be it being a participant in Project Pass or other coaching trainings that you have received, using that larger model of an iteration. But then we want you to kind of dig deeper. These are really those elements that appear within that coaching cycle and sometimes in lots of different places, whether it's the pre-observation, the observation, modeling. So in different places, these are those elements, if you take a deeper dive, that no matter what kind of coaching model, right, or whether you're doing it in person or virtually, that are going to be critical components to making that coaching successful. So whether it's coaching families or whether you're in Project Pass, these are the things. Building that rapport is probably the first and foremost, right? Getting on a virtual platform is in some ways uncomfortable. How can you do that? How can you build rapport virtually? What are some things that you can do? And so we really changed things and learned some lessons. This year we have implemented technology in classrooms. So this is my my picture on the Kubi. So the Kubi, for those of you that are not in this year's cohort and have been a previous Project Pass site, we have added technology so that I or Noelle Woolard, who you'll see a video in just a little bit, we can remote into a classroom. So we can use an iPad and this Kubi technology. And the Kubi is essentially a robot. And the robot can pan and it can tilt. And so we can have sort of that advantage point of the classroom in an inobtrusive way. So there's not a Stefanie or a Noelle or extra body in your classroom. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of this because we're learning. We don't have all the information or the answers, and we'll address that in just a little bit. But we have changed things. And so we can speak to that, this hybrid model, what can go into it. And that's a part of it, is that observation is now being done in a virtual format. Okay, so thinking about the ways that you can build rapport, and I already spoke to this a little bit, it can be awkward, right? There's a difference between being in person and being able to say, how was your day? And just connecting with people than when you're doing it virtually. You've already got sort of the technology issues that can make people a little bit apprehensive. And then you're trying to kind of get to know them, if you will, over a platform. And think about that when you're interacting with families. Based on what they may or may have as far as experience with these different platforms. And I think all of the state of Virginia has come a long way because there have been some types of platforms, generally speaking, in divisions. But again, thinking about how that can be awkward for us using some of the different features and so forth. And so we don't want that to get in the way of making that connection with the family, because building that rapport is really going to help to show that positive and supportive relationship. So it can be difficult to see what you're doing, or when you're coaching remotely, it can be difficult. So sometimes I don't always get to control, although this is a robot and it has really great capabilities. One of the things that I tell Alicia is, why can't the thing zoom? And I don't mean zoom as in the platform, I mean zoom in, right? Get closer. So if I'm there in person and I want to observe something that's going on in the corner of the room, I can simply get up and go over to the corner of the room. This becomes a little trickier when there might be a specific practice going on with a specific child that I want to look at to see and provide to observe, and then be able to coach and do sort of the, we do have that bug in the ear capability. So we have where I could actually talk to the teacher in her ear and say, maybe, provide that reinforcer quicker, or so, whatever it is that I'm doing, or modeling something, right? Well, you can't always do that if you can't see or hear necessarily what's going on. Now I can hear usually pretty well, but again, I don't always have that great vantage point if something's going on, or if there's a back, say the teacher's back turned to me and she's across the room. You have to realize that this is still in a stable position. Okay, so there are limitations.
I would just briefly add to that that when we think about observing and getting video that we can make meaning out of, right? The live session may not always be the best. It may not always even be possible. And so this is where we talk about recording video, submitting video, and moving from there. And one of the new things that we're going to try with Project Pass this coming year, which no one really knows yet, is that we're going to use a platform called Torch that allows us to upload videos, and then we can coach these participants through what we see on the video, and we can give feedback that's through that. It almost looks like a Facebook video, right? Like where you get to make comments and you can go back and forth. And so it's this interactive comment feature. And so we're really excited about that. And as that unfolds, we can't wait to update you on that even more. But one of the reasons why we are doing that, though, is because it is so hard to get really good observations through live Kubi and Zoom. Sometimes you have to think about some alternatives. Okay, so you're probably thinking, okay, this is all really good information, but A, holy cow, no. And B, I don't even know where to begin with this, right? So I am the training person. I try to break things down as simply as possible. So I want to just jump right into this, and let's just break it down systematically, right? Okay. So the first step that we're going to have to think about is preparing for this, right? And this is a pretty big step, right? This is not just I kind of think I want to do this. There's just a few things I got to think out. Maybe it's Zoom versus Teams. Maybe there's a couple of things I got to think about. This is actually where you really want to put the thought into that training package, right? What do you want your parents, your families, and your caregivers to get out of this and be able to implement? And something that's realistic in the home environment, something that you can coach them through. I mean, this cannot be a fantastically complex, system here or intervention. This has to be something that's doable, right? It's feasible, it's meaningful, kind of be, I would be very considerate about what it is that you choose and why that you choose it, right? So there's some thought that has to go into that preparation part. So when we talk about planning and preparing, so you've got to talk about a platform for live sessions. Every division is going to have its own rules and regulations about platforms and can we do this? Is it even possible? So we're not going to make any recommendation on any single particular platform. And Stefanie, I aren't Zoom, we're not getting paid by Zoom to tell you that this is a great way to do it. There's all kinds of options out there, but you do have to think about this beforehand. You have to kind of work through some of the issues. As a whole, any type of tele-intervention implies that your family has an internet connection and a computer or a tablet of some kind, or maybe even a phone. That's not going to be the case for every family. And this is why, as a whole, Virginia is not choosing not to do this, right? Because in-person instruction is where it's at, and that's where we want to be. But there may be some situations that we can use this. Perhaps maybe we've got families that have health issues that can't come in. Who knows what it is. But we want you to know that there is a way to do some of this. There are platforms that can help. And there is a process that you can use for observing and using that for video submission. Okay, so this is actually where Stefanie and I give our disclaimer that you have got to know your platform. So this entire week, that's all Stephanie and I have done is get online on Zoom and practice giving these presentations and playing with the tech and playing with polls and, playing with breakout rooms and Jamboard and doing it again and then again and again so that we're not thinking about the tech, we're thinking about the content. And the same is true for you. We don't want you to be worried about the tech the whole time you are dealing with implementing anything new like this, right? You're trying to develop rapport with families through this medium, which is hard enough, right? You are trying to train families on these really sometimes complex things, and that is hard enough. You are trying to do all these things. We don't want you to worry about the tech. Okay, we want you to worry about the coaching process. We want you to devote that brain power to the coaching process, not the tech. So you've got to get familiar with it. Okay, so as you plan and prepare, we want you to use that Project Pass experience as your guide. Consider those evidence-based practices. People who are in our current Project Pass cohort are doing Learning Pass. We've actually kind of divided some things up a little differently this year. It's the same content that everyone else in the previous Pass iterations have used, but we're just kind of figuring out if you already have a strength in some of those setting the stage kind of evidence-based practices under antecedent-based interventions, maybe you're ready to move to instruction right away. We don't want to waste your time on stuff that you're already doing really well in the classroom. You're still going to cover that material at some point, but it's not the priority. The priority is where your areas of need are, right? So we have learning paths this year. And so you can still have a box set of systematic evidence-based practices that you're going to go through with different families, but families may go through at a different path, right? Some families may already have some of these things about structure and visual supports and schedules and transitioning, but they're not really good maybe at reinforcement or prompting, and they need help with that. So consider having those evidence-based practices with that kind of a organized scope and sequence, but you've also got an individualized learning path for people who are ready for more. Limit the number of practices. I always feel really bad about the very first time we implemented Project Pass many years ago because it was all condensed into this really short amount of time. And then we were like, wait a minute, maybe we should do this over a year. Actually, now with Project Pass, we've said, wait a minute, we should be doing this over 2 years. And so we've actually expanded Project Pass now to a 2-year commitment. And so we really want to limit the number of evidence-based practices we're targeting with our Project Pass participants so that we can really focus on that quality of fidelity of implementation, right? We really want to hone in on that and really beef it up. So if you're working with a family, you don't want to say, here's 15 practices we're going to work on this week. That is not feasible, okay? And it is not going to be a meaningful experience. So limit the number, and I would say even limit it even more for families than I would say for professionals. These are families, remember, we're talking about COVID-19. They are working from home. They are maybe unemployed right now. They have children at home. This is a complex time to try and implement anything. So let's really keep it meaningful and limited. Consider that time and complexity, right? We can't have something that a family's got to work on for about 6 hours to get ready to do it, right? This has got to be something that's short, sweet, and to the point, right? It's meaningful. We also want to tell you to adapt a coaching log. We actually have some that we are adapting, and we'll show you some examples throughout. And they will be on that website at some point. And for our Project Pass people, we're just going to go ahead and send those out to you when we have them. And so once we finalize those, you may not even need it this year, but if you do, you've got it in your bucket and you're ready to go. Okay. So think about either adapting one of your own or using one of ours. The other thing is a student profile. Some of you should have, well, actually all of you should have been doing this throughout Project Pass at some point, right? But this is really a focus for one of our first activities that we do before we really jump into coaching with Project Pass now, is creating a really in-depth student profile and thinking about all those different areas of strengths and needs in our children. And so we want to be able to do that virtually as well. And we also want our families to think about this too. So this isn't something we just do on our own and we keep to ourselves. This is something we want to share with families and make it an interactive process. Families can help fill this profile out. Okay, so let's come back to this learning path for just a second. So when you think about maybe some things that you want your families to know in this upcoming, coming year, that maybe something happens and we've got to deal with this, right? Well, on one level, yes, you need to have some really basic child development. I'm going to share things with you about early childhood as a whole. might even have to share things with you about autism spectrum disorder, right? Some families are going to be totally new to this diagnosis that come into your world here in a few months, right? They're just getting a diagnosis. They're coming to grips with even having the word autism associated with their child. They may not know anything else about it other than what they've seen on TV. I still, to this day, get people who tell me, yeah, I know about autism. I've seen Rain Man. Okay, so we still have work to do on this, and this is going to be a part of that child development overall. What do we need to know? Good practices, but also stuff about autism spectrum disorder. Because it's COVID-19, we're going to talk about there are specific things, all of the stuff that we talked about this morning with trauma and resiliency and supporting emotional regulation and, optimism and all of these other things. Those are going to come into play here too. And that's why we spent a lot of time developing that Day in a Life series for families, because we wanted families to have that information and we wanted you to be able to use that information too if you have to coach families through some of these topics. So that is in everybody's hands right now. Most of the things that we've already talked about are already available on that YouTube playlist, the VCU RRTC one. But we're going to continue developing these as the summer unfolds. Expect to see a lot more of the Day in the Life ones. We're going to talk about resilience and a couple other topics that are kind of just more your good child development ones. But we're also going to expand some of our other stuff that's really helpful for families too. If you've happened to see some of our hand washing videos, that one's actually me and, using my hands. We're actually going to see if we can find some examples of younger children doing this rather than just me in my bathroom. Okay, but some of the other things that you might consider are just all of those good things that you learn in Project PASS about applied behavioral analysis, about setting the stage for learning and antecedent-based interventions. But for families, we also want to add in learning through routines, because there's so much that families can do with that child in a short amount of time in just everyday daily routines. This is the heart and blood of early intervention, and there's a reason why it works. It works, okay? And so those routines are extremely powerful moments. And we've actually built in some new resources. One is already finished, but some that are coming this summer. It's called From Breakfast to Bedtime. The first one is what you learn through routines, what children learn through routines, right? It just kind of helps families understand that routines are actually teachable moments here. You are your child's first teacher, and they're learning something every morning when they brush their teeth with you, when they go through and they pick out breakfast in the morning. These are powerful moments, and we want families to recognize that. So as you can see, it took me a little bit of time to get this social communication to weave through this graphic, but I got it. Because social communication is not something that we just work on at the end with families. We're going to work on that all throughout everything that we're going to work with them. Okay, so don't think about social communication as an end goal, or that's something that we're going to work on very last. You're going to work on it throughout the whole thing. So keep about that in mind when you think about that family learning path. So these are some of the resources that I've been talking about already. The COVID Day in the Life series, that's all kind of stuff that has to do with really difficult times. The pandemic is obviously the lens for this, but a lot of the stuff we have adverse situations that pop up in our lives all the time. We talked about that slide earlier where we talked about disease, personal tragedy, poverty. I mean, all of these things are things that happen whether there's a pandemic or not. So some of the things that are in that Day in the Life series can be helpful outside of COVID-19, right? The Explain It, they're meant to be really quick for families, right? Because these families are busy. They don't want a 45-minute lecture. They want something in 5 minutes or less. So this is that really quick explain it. What is it we're talking about? Are we talking about routines and schedules? Are we talking about characteristics of ASD? Whatever it is, we want to help build that resource so that you have something to use with families if you have to work with them, or just for families who need this information no matter what happens. Use What Works series is one that we've started that's about the evidence-based practices themselves. You'll think of, the first one is, I believe, routines and schedules. I can't remember exactly. I don't have it in front of me. We actually have one that's about making a schedule. It's almost like that virtual make and take, right? Okay, families, let's make a schedule. Let's do it together. And it's a step-by-step screencast on how to use something like Canva or PowerPoint to make a schedule that they can use at home. And of course, I've already talked about the From Breakfast to Bedtime series. Now, the thing that's going to be great about our new early childhood website is that not only are we going to have all of these resources for families that you can direct them to, and you can say, look, here's all these great things that you can go do, But we also have things for providers, right? So Project Pass, yes, you guys get all this great package that's delivered right to, sort of your computer, right? But for everybody else that's in early childhood, there's not a good way to bring them into some of the same information and that same content. So we're going to start migrating some parts of Project Pass over to this website so that anybody can use it. We had a VLCA not too long ago, which is a virtual learning community in autism. And one of the things that one of the participants said was, I love all this stuff with Project Pass and it's fantastic, but I can't really coach the kindergarten teacher on any of these things because I don't have access to the trainings sort of once I'm done. And what can I do about this? Well, here we go. This is what we want to do to kind of push that forward is we're going to have resources on that website for providers to use and be able to coach other participants who are not in Project Pass or kindergarten teachers specifically who are, going to have this child next year. So it's going to be a nice 360-degree approach to thinking about this child at home and at school. And then, of course, we also have our courses, right? So the VCUA's course resources, we have self-paced course that are both for families and providers if they want to take it. We have the parent playbook that's been up for years, and we have the Foundations of ASD course. And I don't want to toot my own horn here on that Foundations course because that's one of my babies, but man, I have been getting some great feedback from people who've been doing some professional development in this last few months where things have been off. So I'm just going to say, if you haven't taken that course, it's a great course. You should think about it and definitely refer others to it. And of course, we also have courses that are more specifically for providers, although families can take them, like the evidence-based practices to teach students with ASD course or the ASD for paraprofessionals course. But VCU ACE is not the only training option out there, right? There are many other options that you can use at your fingertips. We've got the AFFIRM modules, which I mentioned earlier when you want to learn more about parent-mediated interventions. You can go there, but you can learn all about all the other evidence-based practices too. It's not just one thing. They have the entire package there. The Iris Center is also a great place to look for resources on evidence-based practices. They have videos, they've got some write-ups. Sometimes you forget about these resources that you heard about way back when you were in college and when you graduated. Let's bring those back in a little bit too. I would say the DEC and NACE websites are good, but sometimes their stuff is behind a paywall. And so I haven't put that on this list because I don't want you to think you have to pay for anything because guess what? There's free stuff out there. The other thing of early childhood topics would be the ECTA Center. These have great performance. There's like the checklists that you can go through. They have ones that are specific for families. Like, do you really use your routines? This is what it might look like. And here's a checklist for you to kind of figure out if you are or not. And in terms of autism spectrum disorder, I would tell you, number one, hands down, Autism Navigator is an excellent site. If you have not been there, you need to go there. They have great videos. They have great resources for families. They have great resources for families on what ASD is and what do the characteristics look like? What do the red flags look like? Okay, so it's a fantastic resource. Autism Speaks 100 Days, great stuff. The CDC also has some really good stuff too, especially when we're talking about I want to learn by reading, or I want to learn by watching, or I want to learn by maybe there's some other, like there's some checklists and tools like that. This gives you a nice variety. So when you're talking about planning and preparing, you not only have to do all the things we just talked about, but you've got to share your resources about research with your families. You want your families to know that you're not wasting your time, you're doing something that's meaningful because the research tells us that it's meaningful, right? We know that this works, or it can work, right? We need them to know about the technological requirements. I know that Dawn has a really great webcast, I can always use the wrong word, with her LEADS website. And I know Stefanie can share this website if you don't already have it. It's a fantastic resource that has a lot of stuff out there. And recently they did a webcast on sort of this, how do we coach families virtually? How do we do some of the stuff? What are some of the technological requirements? There's a great topic, a great conversation about using data and cell phones, and maybe we don't have a computer, but we've got some other options. It was really good stuff. You're going to need to talk to them about the learning and coaching process, and you have to maybe even think about recording a what to expect video. You know, Stefanie and I were worried a little bit this week about everybody using Jamboard and using breakout rooms or using the poll, and so, or the chat feature. And we wanted you to feel comfortable before you even stepped into this Zoom session. That's the kind of the same thing I want you to think about with families. You want them to be comfortable before you even walk in. So our Project Pass people this year have really gotten used to me sending like, hey, this is what you need to expect videos. Like we're preparing everyone for every sort of eventuality so that nobody is worried about the tech. We're worried about the content. Okay. Let's see. So this is Stefanie. I'm going to give my voice a rest and I'm going to let you go.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences, and kind of walk through some of the different components of Project Pass. So we talked about those live sessions and online and so forth. And so thinking about that very first time that I probably showed up to your school division, and you knew you were going to receive Project Pass, how, how that may look different depending on if you're doing that virtually or if you're doing that live, right? So it's similar whether it's virtual or whether it's live, as far as you're going to want to build that rapport. That's what that's about. It's we're so happy to have you, and it's genuine. I don't want to make it sound like it's this canned thing, but we really work on welcoming you, developing that rapport, letting you know that this is going to be a collaborative and supportive process, right? I'm not here as an evaluator. This is kind of how things are going to go. And so many of you, that live session was done where it was, I came in live. And now we've prepared a welcome video. So this past year, we sent a welcome video and then had sort of a Zoom afterwards. So again, we took both elements where we had something pre-recorded that they watched, and then I popped in on a Zoom so that I could meet a team that was farther away in the state. And so those are some of the differences. And then really when we're thinking about how you all would go about or look at this, yes, we are always talking about family focused when I come in, but this is even more so, of course, because you are now helping to support that family, right? We're talking about that very beginning of how we're having to really shift and pivot our focus. And so that's how it's a little bit different, that you are always family focused, and we bring that to the forefront in our trainings and talk about that in the welcoming session. But this is truly different in that manner, that it is that family focused. So if you're doing this in a virtual session, it's probably going to take a little longer, right? You're going to introduce yourself. You're going to use all of these great things that are on the checklist, but it may be a little bit, it might be a little bit longer of a session. You're learning about the family, you're learning about the child, and again, taking a little bit extra time to build that rapport from that very get-go, so that very first welcome session, and preparing families to start this whole process, right? So it may take a little bit longer. Again, I think always letting folks know, whether it's you all as providers or families, know what's going to happen next. I think to Alicia's point, really making sure within that welcome session that at the end of that, you're talking about this is how things are going to go, and this is what to expect, and this is what's going to happen next. So here is just a sample. And again, Alicia and I will make sure that you all have some different examples available. So this might be just an example of a follow-up summary and a plan of what's next from that welcome session, right? So after that welcome session, this is sort of the document. We used a coaching log, right? But this is, again, something that you would have as a plan and to move forward after that welcome session with families.
So I brought this back up in this section because I want you to know that we've already talked about preparing for stuff. We've really kind of talked about really more of a welcome session rather than a live session, right? So just want to differentiate that when we've talked so far about building rapport, this is a welcome session. That's different from some of the live sessions that you'll do with a family, which could look a little different, right? So they've already been introduced to what the package is, what you're going to do, what to expect next. So now we get into the meat of it, right? So you may have to schedule this a little differently, where you do your training package, and then you come back and you do a live session. You're like, what kind of questions do you have? What can we do next? And so these are like, how is it similar to Project Pass, and how is it a little different? Stefanie?
All right. So obviously we talked about that you're going to both of these kind of allow for you to individualize, right, those resources. So we talk about how it's learning paths, And so when you think of sort of your professional development experience, this allows for it. It's similar because it allows for those questions and have those complex. We can talk about complex topics. We can problem solve. You can still do that, right? It's similar in that nature, no matter what, if it's virtual or whatever format. It's different from Project Pass, as far as, and Alicia spoke to this a lot about, families might have a child, on their shoulder and things like that. So you might have to break this down, if you will. You all, when we had live sessions, you were usually, if I came to you, you were able to get out of the classroom for a couple hours, whether you had a substitute teacher, or maybe it was a day, if you were a 4-day-a-week program, I would come for those live sessions on that day. So you didn't have those distractions, right? You were able to sort of devote your time and not have to worry about that. In thinking about that, we need to be cognizant that you might have to have a slower pace with these new topics. So we were able to cover, and sometimes we'd have a big chunk of time, whether it was 2 to 3 hours, and thinking about how that would be different from Project Pass. Families are not necessarily going to have this big chunk of time when they're home caring for their young children and all the other things that go into daily home life. So this would be sort of a session summary. So following up from a session. And again, for those of you that remember our coaching logs, a lot of this would look similar because we'd check off sort of the evidence-based practices that and if we were discussing a case, a case study or whatever, we would check something off, and then it allows for some notes of like what's working. And we did that in our sessions. So it's taking those elements, but again, this is going to be for that family session of what happened virtually. So the learning path, Alicia, is this you?
It is, yes. And
Yeah,
so
okay.
we've already talked about this a little bit. It's evidence-based practices. It's systematic. We're not willy-nilly just going from one thing to the next. We've got a plan ahead in mind, and we're limiting to the number of practices learned at one time. So that's how it's similar to Project Pass. It's different because we're working from home. We have all these family preferences for learning too. Maybe they prefer to read versus watch videos and vice versa. And they're learning under considerable stress. So keep all of this in mind as you develop that learning path. And then observation is going to be really different too. And Stefanie, do you want to talk about this for a second?
Sure. So observation is going to look, the similarities are you're looking at those evidence-based practices, right? When you're observing, I mean, there are lots of other things that you're observing in addition to that, right? I don't want to make it seem like that's the only thing, right? You're looking at the whole child and their interactions with families and lots of other things. But the evidence-based practices are the same regardless. You're still able to observe those virtually. And whether I'm there live or whether I'm doing this through Kubi, I'm still able to see those practices being implemented. In the way that it's different is, so those virtual observations, again, are gonna, I already kind of touched on this. It's gonna be a little different as far as, considering the technology, right? And maybe having to problem solve through and be very clear and specific about what it is that you're going to be looking at, so that you are able to observe that. It's not just I'm just observing, everything during the day, or you really have a very specific thing that you're observing. And this really helps when we think about considering those video submissions like Alicia's talking about, instead of just that cell phone in the pocket running around, that you really want to see a specific time of day. If the parent says to you, I can't get him to transition to this, well, you're going to want to see that and what's going on during that time. So that'd be great if they could let's talk about when that's happening. Oh, would you be able to collect some video, maybe just a few minutes, and send that to me? Again, please, please, please think about whether you're able to do that, whether you have permission to do that. Again, we're just simply throwing out kind of what we do and how that could look. I can't say that enough because, again, we're not here to say, please go and do this, but consider if that is a viable option. So in thinking about feedback, again, I kind of talked about this with that log. It's the same thing as far as you're going to provide ongoing feedback, right? You will, as that family, you want to know, how am I doing? I can remember being observed in a classroom and, somebody with a clipboard walking around and never hearing a word from that person. And it was very disturbing to me. I was like, what are they looking on? Was I doing well? Was I not? Right. So not knowing, and that big ambiguity of why were you here and what was going on, that's stressful. So again, for families to be able to have that ongoing feedback, it's going to be similar, right? That we're going to use what's working. What are your concerns and challenges? Being specific and providing specific feedback on those evidence-based practices. So something like, you provided 5 seconds of wait time, and I noticed he seemed to be still struggling to give you an answer. Perhaps, and really hone in on what it is. You're able to do that virtually or in person. It's different, in that you're probably, you're getting that written feedback. um, I may have sent that to you email wise, or given it to you right there at that coaching session if we were live. You're using those layman's terms, right? We're not going to, as a BCBA, I'm not going to go into and use the lingo and things that the family is not yet ready for. And so we need to be really cognizant of that, whereas you have had some training in those evidence-based practices. So I was able to use some of those terms with you. So, and this is just a family video feedback. So if they were able, to submit a video, or you observed on video, providing that concrete feedback. And so kind of what you noticed, what practices you noticed, having a checklist, again, having a common area, maybe some suggestions, right? Some, maybe try this with the wait time. If that was just an example that I gave, but there are many others that of course would apply. And so, progress is important with everything. We have whole courses on data collection and progress monitoring, and it is so critical, right? We want to know, is this working for you? Is it not? Progress monitoring should take place regardless of how you're presenting this coaching, right? Or these supports. It's different from Project Pass because we've had, obviously some different related challenges and barriers. And then it's also probably, it's going to be more family driven as far as the progress, right? What would you like your child to do? Whereas the classroom, yes, you're taking into consideration the family and what's going on, but it's going to look different as far as what progress you're taking or what data collection you're taking in a classroom versus what a family would like to have as a priority and what they're collecting data on.
So when we think about families and how would I even possibly prepare a family for this kind of teleintervention, because oh my gosh, there's so much that has to go into even preparing them for this kind of system, right? We do want you to know that we thought about this, right? And we know, we know this is not easy, and it's not going to be something where a lot of families are even going to be interested in. But for the situations where maybe this comes up and maybe there is some interest, we do have an upcoming BCUACE Lunch and Learn topic in July. So BCUACE has been doing some lunch and learns all along throughout this COVID closure, and topics are all over the place. It depends if we're talking about things at home, teaching academics, transitioning, social communication supports. We're actually going to have 3 early childhood specific topics in July. July 16th, and then whatever the following week is every week for the rest of that month. I don't know the dates off the top of my head. I know July 16th because that's my birthday. So we will be presenting some topics, and one of them is about preparing families for teleintervention in the case that this is something that has to happen for certain families. So we're going to do a couple other different topics. We might do something about kind of the basics of ABA, because I think families also need to know about some of these things as we go into the fall, whether or not COVID is a problem. And then we haven't quite determined what the last one will be just yet. But we'll definitely send those out to you so that you know, and you can, those are recorded, and they'll also be on our YouTube channel and on our website. So I know we've given you a lot to think about. You may have a lot of questions about this kind of stuff. You may want to sit and think about it and send us some questions. That's okay too. We're actually going to move into, in the next section, we're going to talk about evidence-based practices, and kind of bring this all home that, you know what, there's a lot of things we talked about that are really different and very chaotic. And oh my gosh, I'm not ready for anything in this world. We're going to bring it back to things that you are comfortable with and things that do make a little more sense to you. So if you have questions and things have come up and you're not quite sure, please feel free to just put it in the chat. We'll try and answer it as things come up, or you can send us an email at any time.